Yes.
The Bar Association, Nassau County Bar Association, had a theme which was John Adams' influence on the law from his defense of the soldiers at the Boston Massacre through the Alien and Sedition Act all the way through to Guantanamo, because the Alien and Sedition Act sort of paralleled Guantanamo. And I very foolishly said, oh, I've got a costume from that era. Maybe add some color. And I could say some of the things that Adams said, and it turned out that Adams didn't say very much about the Alien and Sedition Act. In fact, he seemed to be rather embarrassed about it. It's sort of a war necessity. But I did find this guy, James Callender, who William Safar wrote a book about, an author about, well annotated. About half the book is a footnote, well not half the book, but about a third of the book is footnotes about where he got his material. And I was able to download his Callender's first book, which was published before the Alien and Sedition Act. And from that I extracted a lot of material that he said that could be applied to this war that was going on between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans in about 1891 over the who we would prefer to go to war with, France or England. And there were a lot of people who didn't want to go to war with anybody. It took a long time, but I prepared, along with Susan Gill, who pulled up the Abigail Adams stuff that was said in defense of the Alien and Sedition Act. And so we had this program. It was fairly well received, considering I was told by somebody that the program had gone on way too long before they introduced us, which put us in something of a handicap. I did come up with a lawyer joke, which I only had time to tell twice. It goes on for a long time. Dr. Nathaniel Ames' wife had owned a tavern, and the situation gave rise to Ames versus Gay, one of the famous lawsuits of New England. Ames, a compulsively litigious man, claimed inheritance to her estate according to the province law through their son Fisher against his mother-in-law Hannah, who claimed rights to it under the common law. The struggle continued by her family after she died in December 1744. In August 1749, Ames won the case and thus established an exception to the rule of inheritance in Massachusetts. However, 2 of the 11 Superior Court of the Judicature justices were against him, leading the normally amiable Ames to an especially vituperative stance against lawyers for the rest of his career. He took down his tavern sign and replaced it with a cartoon of the judges, all easily identifiable. Each was shown studying the province laws, except the 2 dissenters, who had their backs turned to the law books. Chief Justice Paul Dudley, one of the dissenters, sent the sheriff to arrest Ames and confiscate the libelous portrait. Ames was warned and quickly substituted Matthew chapter 16, verse 4, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given unto it." So, Callender, let's see, we're going to skip that part. Okay. So, Callender had fled Scotland and had written a pamphlet, Deformities of Samuel Johnson, anonymously, as well as various political pamphlets, pessimistic of human nature, critical of the liberal notion of progress. He admired Jonathan Swift and used his own writings to cut the wealthy and political down to size. He decided to leave England after writing The Political Progress of Britain, a critique of imperialism and corruption. And when his imminent arrest was rumored, by 1794 he became a regular freelance commentator on American politics and joined with other radical Republicans and journalists, putting him at odds with the Federalists. He attacked their position with reasoned argument, satire, and personal invective. He also attacked the excise tax, but his real notoriety came with his invective against Washington He exposed a sexual relationship between Hamilton and a married woman, Maria Reynolds, the subsequent blackmail of Hamilton and his alleged financial corruption. In his 1797 pamphlet, he said Hamilton's affair was actually a distraction from his greater offense, that being his partnering with Reynolds' husband in corrupt financial dealings. Hamilton denied the financial part, but admitted the adultery. Nothing was proven, but Hamilton never held further office. Regretfully, by 1798, Callender hit hard times. His wife died of yellow fever. His anonymously published political attacks were exposed by a rival pamphleteer, and he fled Philadelphia to Virginia, leaving his children behind. Jefferson was impressed by his attacks on Hamilton and wanted to create a counterforce to the Federalist press. Jefferson finally financially supported Callender's anti-Federalist pamphlet, The Prospect Before Us, which attacked political corruption and the Adams administration in his own special way. He completed it while living in Virginia. And at this point, we'll begin the first part of an imaginary interview between Abigail Adams and James Callender, which never happened, as we've taken words from both of them and created this dialogue. In the first year of Washington's administration, Adams became deeply involved in a month-long Senate controversy over the official title of the president. Adams favored titles such as His Majesty the President or His High Mightiness. The pomposity of his stance, along with his being overweight, led to Adams earning the nickname His Rotundity.
As a former ambassador, John knew of the way other nations are impressed by titles. He did not want our nation to be at a disadvantage in that regard.
And you have been called the Duchess of Braintree. The Federalist Party comprises Tories who are agents of the British East India Company and the Bank of England, who seek a return to monarchy and mercantilism, where cronies of the rulers get special privileges and suppress the free market and let them overcharge the people of England, of her colonies, and of the world. The Jay Treaty of 1794 had the ostensible purpose to stop the British Navy from impressing our sea. And how did that work out for us? They have impressed thousands of American sailors, enslaved on British warships where they are whipped, starved, and mistreated. These Federalists built British privateers in the United States to prey on American ships. At Liverpool, a press gang kidnapped an American sailor. American sailors formed a force, found the press gang, freed the sailor, killed one of the gang, threw another in the dock where he drowned, beat another, and the rest fled. Liverpool's mayor objected, saying to the American captain, "Control your seamen." And the American captain replied, "Mayor, control your press gangs." And that's the way we should be dealing with impressment. Every step of investigation discovers more clearly the utter ignorance, negligence, and corruption of His Excellency John Jay. This envoy might have dictated his own terms about the West India trade, yet he contented to a stipulation: we were not to keep the British Islands from starving by freighting any vessels larger than 50 tons import. But the real purpose of the John Jay Treaty was to get us into war with France to help England. There is a popular slogan: damn John Jay, damn everyone that won't damn John Jay, and damn everyone that won't put lights in his window and sit up all night damning John Jay.
Ah, yes, 1796, the Jay Treaty. Washington was president. It was not a strong treaty, but it did avoid war. Adams told me, mum's the word regarding its contents, but to John, a flawed treaty was preferable than war with Britain.
So President George Washington was disappointed with the treaty's provisions, but he submitted it to the Senate. The Senate reluctantly passed Jay's treaty by a vote of 20 to 10, exactly the 2/3 required for approval. The House of Representatives had to appropriate funds for the treaty's implementation. Opponents of the House attempted to block the appropriation bill. During the debate in the House, Jefferson wrote that the most remarkable political occurrence with us has been the treaty with England, to which no man in the U.S. has had the effrontery to affirm that it was not a very bad one, except Alexander Hamilton. Its most zealous defenders only pretended that it was better than war. I have never known the public pulse to beat so full and in such universal union on any subject since the Declaration of Independence. And yet, like so much bad legislation, it passed. The appropriation for the treaty was narrowly approved by a vote of 51 to 48 on April 30th, 1796.
But the treaty is now law, and the president must honor it.
But the British are not honoring it. Their conduct is now in direct violation of the treaty, which to England is of equal concern with the violation of a pancake.
Would you have us go to war with England?
No, but your fellow Federalists would have us war with France. France is a much more powerful opponent than England. Every nation fears her except the Tories and the moneyed interests of our country. A Federalist Tory, William Garvey, has set up a gazette for the express end of reviling France. He does not conceal his design of bringing the nation into a French war. Sincerity is always respectable, and he cannot be charged with a want of that virtue. We find the British ambassador paying Mr. Cobbett for his labors writing against the French. But the ambassador goes further and bribes Federalist officials. To trace the conspiracy, Congress appoints a committee of 5 members. Of these, 3 are Tories. One of them is the intimate friend of the British ambassador. This is a novel way to discover plots.
Perhaps if your Mr. Jefferson would return from his plantation at Monticello and be the vice president, he could exert some influence over the Senate, that which he is supposed to preside over.
Let us not be reviling a distant nation for having, like most of ourselves, granted an universal right of conscience. To speak plainly, some of the holders of public stock with Alexander Hamilton in their van have excited this clamor. They embrace every opportunity to revile and exasperate the French, to whom we were at first indebted for independence. As evidence of the greatness of Britain, Hamilton says that her East India territories yield an annual revenue of more than 8 million sterling. But I point you to Burgoyne's picture of the British East India Company. The British East India Company are both losing money and bleeding England dry by requiring a great military to enforce the East India Company's advantages. They have often been on the brink of bankruptcy and would have stopped payment many years ago if Parliament had not lent them large sums of money. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was written in 1776. Most people see Wealth of Nations as an explanation of the free market, but it was written as an attack on mercantilism, subsidized companies, and crony capitalism.
The French have ransacked the coffers of the rich, stripped poverty of its very rags, robbed the infant of its birthright, wrenched the crutch from tottering old age, and joining sacrilege to burglary, have plundered the altars of God.
All this and much more is true, but in general morality, the British are as bad as other people, and often much worse. John Burgoyne was chairman of an inquiry before the House of Commons as to the conduct of the East India Company. He says that such a scene of inequity, rapine, and injustice, such unheard of cruelty, such open violations of every rule of morality, every tie of religion, and every principle of good government was never before discovered. And this passage occurs in the first of more than 300 pages showing specifics. Burgoyne proved that in 5 or 6 years, the servants of the company had destroyed, starved, or driven away a greater number of people than were contained in all the British colonies. After such a review, we need not be afeared of the cruelty of the Jacobites.
The French have breached their public credit.
Our British ally is descending with silly leaps to the same level. On the 27th of February, 1797, the Privy Council of George III, by an arbitrary order, forbade the Bank of England from issuing any cash in payment. The reason given is an apprehension of the want of sufficient cash to answer the exigencies of public service. They say, you shall not pay your private debts. We must have the money to pay our own salaries and to support our standing armies, and to clear off the bills of a prince who has defrauded his ministries, insulted his 2 living wives, hired the newspapers to calumniate his mother, and attempted to keep his father for life in a strait waistcoat. The ruin of the British system of funds and paper money would run the hazard of sharing the same lessons with the United States. That is why persons connected with the bank have such a violent preposition for British success and so strong an aversion to the ascendancy of the French. The bankers and the stockholders, is that my time is up? The bankers and stockholders were joined by two other classes, the British Tories and mercantile speculators, which could only expand its flight on the wings of paper money. Alexander Hamilton has always been considered as the leader of this party. Hamilton holds between 300 and 400 shares of the Bank of the United States. We may reckon safely that this has netted at least $200,000. The books of transfer at the Treasury and the books at the bank are held secret under the obligation of an oath not to reveal the names or the amount of the stockholders. So much concealment can hardly be good.
I do not like Hamilton. Beware that spare Cassius. Has always occurred to me when I have seen that cock sparrow. The very devil is in his eyes.
Let's discuss Alexander Hamilton and his singular mode of correspondence with a certain Maria Reynolds. Alexander Hamilton printed a denial of his connection with Maria Reynolds, but that was proved false. He subsequently came from New York to complete a more satisfactory statement. Mr. Hamilton entreated others to attest his innocence, that is to say, their belief of his having debauched Mrs. Reynolds. Hamilton thinks this adultery is proper because he says he never gave government funds and favors as hush money to Mrs. Reynolds. Let's change the subject now to the 1798 Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed. There were 4 separate laws. The Naturalization Act extended the duration of residence required for aliens to become citizens of the United States from 5 years to 14 years. The second act, the Alien Act, authorized the President to deport any resident alien considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. It was activated June 25th, 1798, with a 2-year expiration date. 15,000 Frenchmen were intimidated into selling their assets and departing the United States.
I told my son, John Quincy, that a formal declaration of war ought to undoubtedly have been made. John Adams considered Jefferson's affection for the French and his hostility towards the British as essentially economic. Jefferson owed a reported £7,000 to British merchants since the Revolution. However, I was convinced it had more to do with his religious views. I was certain Jefferson was an atheist. I know Mr. Jefferson to be deficient in that only sure and certain security which binds man to man and renders him responsible to his maker. The horrors of the French Revolution made me believe that some are fit for rule and others for submission. The French had taken more than 300 trading vessels. At one point, French captors of an American ship tortured the captain of the vessel with thumb screws in an unsuccessful attempt to make him admit he was carrying British cargo. I'm expecting war with France and eagerly anticipating it. My husband is far more hesitant to support a war, but to him the Alien and Sedition Acts always were to be war measures. John knew there was need enough of both, and therefore he consented to them. Adamant hope for neutrality was established by George Washington regarding France. But the French had inflicted a wound in the American breast. John Adams hoped it would heal. The measures of defense that were needed resulted in the Sedition Acts. We should fear the enemy within. French immigrants are all over America and number more than 25,000 in Philadelphia alone. They have established newspapers, schools, bookstores, boarding houses, restaurants. The French are everywhere. And how could their threat be measured if America were to go to war with France? Not only were the French suspicious, but there was the wild Irish refugees from the Irish Rebellion of 1798, who were thought to have dangerous radicals in their ranks. They were decidedly anti-British, so they sided with the Republicans. James T. Callender is a prime example of this type, despite the fact he is a Scot.
The third act was the Alien Enemies Act. It authorized the President to apprehend and deport resident aliens if their home countries were at war with the United States of America. Enacted in July 6, 1798, and providing no sunset provision, this act remains intact today.
The French government had placed secret agents, men bent on destroying John Adams, the American Republic, and Christianity throughout the United States. If the French Jacobins are not suppressed, we shall come to civil war.
While the government authorities prepared lists of aliens for deportation, many aliens fled the country during the debate over the Alien and Sedition Acts.
John Adams never signed a deportation order.
The Sedition Act was the fourth act. It made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or its officials. It was enacted July 14, 1798, with an expiration date of March 3, 1801, the day before Adams' presidential term was to end.
The stirrer-up of sedition should be punished. I hope the Alien Bill is not curtailed and clipped until it is made nearly useless.
The government has imprisoned a newspaper man in irons. What use could there be for keeping a man in irons? A good stone wall would have answered enough. If a man was to be hanged for stealing a horse, what shall we make of Congress and their agents who forcibly pilfered so many Continental soldiers that are yet unpaid? No certainty existed of the soldiers' Continental certificates being funded by the new government, and much less that they're being funded at the full nominal value. Congress objected that it could not afford to pay its war veterans their back pay. At the same time, they gave John Adams $14,000 to buy furniture for his house. Among the speculators were members of Congress who bought up the Continental certificates at a cheap rate with a view of thereafter voting for their being funded at full price. A Federalist congressman dispatched pilot boats to buy up Continental certificates. They were obtained at 10% of their face value. Then, by a special act of Congress, and $150,000 of his precious commodity were transferred from the public stocks into the stock of the Bank of the United States. There, the congressman draws 8% interest for the full face value of the notes, which originally cost him but 10%. In plainer words, he advanced $10 to serve his country, and by various steps now draws a yearly interest for them at the rate of $8. A nation cannot help flourishing when under the artifices of such a disinterested legislator. And yet the Sedition Act forbids us from reporting on such scandalous events.
The acts were shaved and pared to almost nothing.
I'll admit they were never used against your Federalist newspapers, but here are the journalists prosecuted in jail. Benjamin Franklin Bosch, the grandson of Benjamin Franklin, was editor of the Aurora, a Republican newspaper. Bosch had accused George Washington of incompetence and financial irregularities, and the blind, bald, crippled, toothless, querulous Adams of nepotism and monarchical ambition.
The government did not wait for the passage of the Sedition Act, but arrested Bache on common law libel charges 2 weeks before the act was signed by the president.
Bache died of yellow fever in 1798 while awaiting trial.
Bearing neither malice nor ill will towards anyone, not even the most deluded, I wish the laws of our country were competent to punish the stirrer-up of sedition, the writer and printer of base and unfounded calumny.
Now we're going to jump forward along here. By June of 1800, we had the narrator do this at Master of Ceremonies at the Bar Association. Callender's attacks in their style had severely irritated the Adams administration, and they prosecuted him under the Sedition Act. His trial was presided over by Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. He was sentenced to a $200 fine and imprisoned until the last day of Adams' administration. He was pardoned by Jefferson along with other journalists after Jefferson took office in March of this year. As you are all aware, Mr. Callender was imprisoned under the obnoxious and unconstitutional Alien and Sedition Acts enacted by John Adams, our former president. Now that Mr. Callender is out of jail, I don't he might like to have an opportunity to speak to John Adams, the man responsible for his incarceration. Regretfully, President Adams was unavailable, but we were able to convince Abigail Adams to reflect on her husband's presidency with Mr. Callender. And then we go back to our performance here. Matthew Lyon was a congressman from Vermont. He was indicted under the Sedition Act for an essay he had written in the Vermont Journal accusing the administration of ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. Supreme Court Justice Patterson, presiding at trial, denied Lyon's defense of unconstitutionality of this statute, fined Lyon $1,000, and sentenced him to 4 months in prison. While in prison, Lyon continued to write and won re-election. After his release, he returned to Congress. Luther Baldwin, a private citizen, was indicted for a comment he made during a visit by President Adams to Newark, New Jersey. The president was greeted by a crowd and by a committee that saluted him by firing a cannon. A bystander said, "There goes the president, and they are firing at his ass." Baldwin replied that he did not care if they fired through his ass. He was convicted in the federal court for speaking seditious words tending to defame the president and government of the United States, and fined $100. In November of 1798, David Brown led a group in Dedham, Massachusetts, in setting up a liberty pole with the words, "No Stamp Act, no Sedition Act, no alien bills, no land tax, downfall to the tyrants of America, peace and retirement to the president. Long live the vice president." Brown was arrested. Brown was tried in June 1799. Brown pled guilty, but Justice Samuel Chase asked him to name others who had assisted him. Brown refused, was fined $480, and sentenced to 18 months in prison. And then, in my book, The Prospect Before Us, I call the Adams administration a continual tempest of malignant passions, and the president a repulsive pedant, a gross hypocrite, and an unprincipled oppressor. I was indicted under the Sedition Act. My counsel attempted to argue the unconstitutionality of the Sedition Act, but Justice Samuel Chase of the Supreme Court refused to permit the jury to determine the constitutionality of this federal statute, even though the statute gave the jury the right to determine the law and the fact. I was convicted, and Chase fined me $200 and sentenced me to 9 months in jail. The Republican prediction that the Sedition Act would be used as a tool to assure the primacy of the Federalists was confirmed by the fact that no Federalist editor was indicted for equally rough language toward Republicans. The Sedition Act was not construed to mean the Federalists were to cease maligning the Vice President Jefferson, who was called a vain author, a false prophet, and a thoroughbred Frenchman.
George Washington died December 14, 1799. One of the first acts of Jefferson was to liberate the wretch Callender for crimes of writing the lowest and vilest slander which malice could invent or calumny exhibit. The remission of Callender's crime was a public approbation of his conduct. Jefferson is a godless man. He was also one who mocked the Christian faith. Word went out that if he was elected president, everyone should lock up their Bibles. Even Martha Washington called him the most detestable of mankind.
Unfortunately for the Duchess of Braintree, these Alien and Sedition Acts so outraged the voters that the Federalists and John Adams lost the election.
The task of the president is very arduous, very perplexing, and very hazardous. I do not wonder Washington wished to retire from it.
And now we'll go back to the narrator's voice. Things didn't work out too well for James Callender. He tried to get appointed postmaster of Richmond, Virginia, but Jefferson refused. He actually became the editor of a Federalist paper, the Richmond Recorder, attacking the political corruption on all sides, including Jefferson, and how Jefferson had funded Callender's earlier pamphleteering. Of course, the president denied this, but Callender published Jefferson's letters, clearly supporting Callender's position. Jefferson's people attacked Callender, claiming he abandoned his wife to die of venereal disease in Philadelphia. But that was a lie. She had yellow fever. Her doctor bled her, but the treatment failed. Callender then used a series of articles accusing Jefferson of fathering children by his slave, Sally Hemings. Callender, amazingly enough, did not get along with everybody. In fact, one of his former defense attorneys, George Hay, clubbed him in the head with a walking stick in retaliation for an article Callender wrote about Hay's connection with some international incident. On July 17, 1803, Callender drowned in 3 feet of water in the James River, reportedly too drunk to save himself. No one in town gave much credence to the coroner's verdict of accidental drowning. Most seemed to take it for granted that Callender's sudden demise had been hastily arranged and hushed up as some kind of cover-up. Hamilton's biographer Hendrickson is cited in, let's see, oh, I'm sorry, that's just a citation. William Safford based his historical novel Scandalmonger on Callender. His research includes letters of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, and the end of the novel has a 44-page section called the Underbook, which provides the historical information and footnotes that enable you to tell which is novel and what's fact. And that's it. I'll take any questions you have, or we'll take any questions you have about Exactly. Right. And in fact, that was the conclusion of people at that evening. Yeah, the Federal Reserve System still operates in secret, as did the first bank in the United States, and it's still pillaging the people of America, and we still have people stealing. You still have bad legislation passing by the slimmest margin possible, but passing nonetheless. After everybody says how bad it is, when sometime around midnight it slips through, and yeah, so the debate really illustrates how similar it is. The concern with Arab terrorists today and the willing to trample on the constitutional rights of people that existed under the Patriot Act is very similar to what was going on under the Alien and Sedition Act. Most of that, I mean, there's some things where I shorten things up to make them go a little faster, but most of this is James Callender's own words or the words of his contemporaries. And Abigail Adams, Sue Gill pulled all that stuff out, and she provided the various vituperations against the French. Perhaps it's a good thing that those 15,000 Frenchmen left instead of staying around and Frenchifying our country.
You're missing on restaurants.
They only became so imaginative with their food because they didn't have steak.
The politicians since have referred to the Alien and Sedition Acts as the good old days.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Eleanor, for coming. Those of you who are coming to Hofstra will meet in the parking lot that's on the map at 4. Pick up the chairs. No, there's no snack while we're here. This is a museum.
We've got 33 minutes left.